السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. تنبيه: القراءة على الشيخ أحد وجوه التحمل عند الجمهور، وأبعد من أبى ذلك من أهل العراق، وقد اشتد إنكار الإمام مالك وغيره من المدنيين عليهم في ذلك حتى بالغ بعضهم فرجحها على السماع من لفظ الشيخ، وذهب جم منهم البخاري وحكاه في أوائل صحيحه عن جماعة من الأئمة إلى أن السماع من لفظ الشيخ والقراءة عليه يعني في الصحة والقوة سواء، والله أعلم. والإنباء من حيث اللغة واصطلاح المتقدمين بمعنى الإخبار، إلا في عرف المتأخرين فهو للإجازة كعن، لأنها في عرف المتأخرين للإجازة. Hafiz ibn Hajar rahmallah mentioned words that indicate that the student heard from the Shaykh, and then followed it up by discussing words that indicate that the student read and the Shaykh listened. He now discusses the ruling of attaining a narration in this way, where the Shaykh is silent and only listening, and the student is reading. So he says, تنبيه القراءة على الشيخ أحد وجوه التحمل عند الجمهور. Reading to a Shaykh is one of the valid ways of obtaining a narration, and it was not only accepted in theory, but this is how narrations were obtained. The reality is that ahadith were transmitted like this. Al-Imam Munawi rahmallah said, Al-Mansur alladhi alayhi al-amal. That the practice is on this year, and narrations are transmitted in this way. In his Ilal, Imam Tirmidhi rahmallah said, Faslun fi qawanini riwayat al-hadith. And thereafter he mentioned that reading to a Shaykh, irrespective of how the recitation is done, it is valid. So he said, وَالْقِرَاءَةُ عَلَى الْعَالِمِ إِذَا كَانَ يَحْفَظُ مَا يَقْرَأُ عَلَيْهِ. So either the Shaykh, he memorized everything. So you're reading what your book, and the Shaykh, he's sitting there because he knows everything by memory. أو يمسك أصله فيما يقرأ عليه إذا لم يحفظ. Or maybe he's just following in his own book. هو صحيح عند أهل الحديث. This here is correct, and it's a valid way of transmitting a narration according to the muhaddithin. Alama Iraqi rahmallah mentioned a huge list of tabi'een and others who all mentioned that it is fine. And he then said that it is impossible to count the vast amount of scholars who held this view. So he said, وَمِمَّنْ قَالَ بِصِحَّتِهَا مِنَ التَّابِعِينَ عطاء ونافع وعروة والشعبي والزهري ومكحول والحسن ومنصور وأيوب. Thereafter then he said, so that's all tabi'in. Then he said, ومن الأئمة ابن جريج والثوري وابن أبي ذئب وشعبة والأئمة الأربعة وابن مهدي وشريك والليث وأبو عبيد والبخاري في خلق لا يحصون كثرة. So many scholars of the earlier times, and the time when riwayat was being transmitted, when you were dependent on a chain. In those times, the vast majority of scholars held this view. But in spite of this huge group, it is only the view of majority. So that means that there will have to be a minority who holds a different view. So Hafiz ibn Hajar rahmallah mentions with regards to these scholars who maintained a different view, and they regarded qira'ah al-shaykh to be an invalid way of obtaining a narration. وَأَبْعَدَ مَنْ أَبَى ذَلِكَ. He's saying that they are really far-fetched. Those who refuse and they reject qira'ah al-shaykh, they have really gone too far. Alama ibn Hajar rahmallah, he confines this, and he says that it was a very few scholars, and that too also from a very particular place. They regarded qira'ah al-shaykh to be invalid. From which place? Min ahli al-Iraq. He say they were Iraqis. What Mullah al-Qari rahmallah clarifies that this here is a really small group of scholars. وَهُمْ شِرْذِمَةٌ قَلِيلَةٌ. It's a really small group of scholars who held this view. In fact, there are a maximum of only 4 known scholars who held this view. How many? Only 4. So this view is attributed to Imam Abu Asim an-Nabil, then Imam Waqti', Muhammad ibn Salam, and Abdurrahman al-Jumahi. So these 4 scholars. Now you only have 4, then to the chain which links to Abu Asim an-Nabil with this addition, that sanad is weak. Plus a contradicting verdict has also been transmitted from him, that he also regarded Qira al-Shaykh to be correct. So you can actually cancel his name from this list. That means you have left with 3 more scholars. Then the statements of these 3 scholars can also be interpreted. That you maybe the way you're looking at it and the understanding you're taking from it is that they regard it to be invalid, but maybe they were discussing something else. So therefore, from the galaxy of muhaddithin, you have only between 2 to 4 scholars, maximum 4 scholars, who are from whom it is quoted. Instead of saying who claim, you have to be particular on your words. So you say from the galaxy of muhaddithin, you have between 2 to 4 scholars from whom it is quoted and who it is attributed to that they regarded Qira al-Shaykh to be incorrect. So 2 to 4 is kal adam in front of so many muhaddithin, the hundreds and thousands of scholars of hadith. So, and there too also, like we said, you cannot even firmly and absolutely attribute it to this 4 scholars, because maybe they held different views. So therefore, Alam al-Qani rahmallah said, بل أجمع المحدثون على صحة الأخذ والتحمل بها ولم يقيدوا بالخلاف فيها. That the muhaddithun, you can rather say there's ijma'. For 2 to 3 scholars, why you don't even say that there's this very small وَأَبْعَدَ مَنْ أَبَى ذَلِكَ? Rather, you say there's ijma', everybody agreed that Qira al-Shaykh is a valid way. Nevertheless, these scholars were from Iraq. So Hafiz ibn Hajar rahmallah mentioned that scholars from Medina, they really criticized these scholars. وَقَدْ اشْتَدَّ إِنْكَارُ الْإِمَامِ مَالِكِ وغيره من المدنيين عليهم في ذلك. That Imam Malik and other Madani scholars, they really criticize them on this view, that they're saying that Qira al-Shaykh is not valid. To show you how severely Imam Malik rahmallah criticized, when you go to Ma'arifa Ulum al-Hadith of Imam Malik, of Imam Hakim rahmallah, so first it's quoted, Imam Hakim brings his sanad to Mutarrif ibn Abdullah. So first it's quoted from him, that Sahibtu Malikan 17 sana. I stayed in the company, in the companionship of Imam Malik for 17 years. 17 years. فَمَا رَأَيْتُهُ قَرَأَ الْمُوَطَّةَ عَلَى أَحَدٍ. Yet Imam Malik, as a teacher, he never recited the Muwatta. He always made the student read the Muwatta. And therefore, to follow this practice, inshallah, when we have our Muwatta, just because it's the sunnah and the practice of Imam Malik, and then the students of Imam Malik, it's now transmitted from them too, that they would make their students read and they would make their students read. So inshallah, when we do the Muwatta, then also, well, like that the students have to read. So he's saying for 17 years, you can imagine basically throughout his life, Imam Malik rahmallah never read the Muwatta. He would make the students read. And this here is also what happens today in the Darul Ulums. The teacher, the Ustad doesn't read. It's the students. So whether it's the girls' Darul Ulums or whether it's the boys' Darul Ulums, even when there are male asatida in the female Darul Ulums, then too they make the female students read. So it's like the accepted and established practice in all the Darul Ulums which I have been to. So you're saying that فَمَا رَأَيْتُ قَرَأَ الْمُوَطَّةَ عَلَى أَحَدٍ. And thereafter now he said, وَسَمِعْتُهُ يَأْبَى أَشَدَّ الْإِبَاعَ عَلَى مَنْ يَقُولُ لَا يُجْزِيهِ إِلَّا السَّمَاءُ. I heard him very severely criticizing those who say that it's not valid unless you hear the narrations from your Shaykh. You cannot be the one reading to your Shaykh. And thereafter Imam Malik rahmallah would say that كيف لا يجزيك هذا في الحديث ويجزيك في القرآن والقرآن أعظم. That everybody accepts that the student can read the Quran to the Ustad, and that will be fine, and that's acceptable. An acceptable way of qira'ah is that the student reads to the Shaykh, and especially knowing the pronunciations, the laws of tajweed, and then in a different qira'at, to pronounce the words, to make the imala properly, etc. So the student reads. It's inevitable in qira'ah. It has to be that the student read, and everybody is accepting it. So Imam Malik rahmallah is saying that how can you accept it in Quran? Well, Quran a'zam. وكيف لا يقنعك أن تأخذه عرضا والمحدث أخذه عرضا. And then you don't want to accept it in hadith, and that too. So that's the first argument. Imam Malik is saying that the first argument is compared to the Quran. You're allowing it for the Quran. There ought to be more stringent laws for the Quran. So you cannot put more stringent laws for hadith. And the second is he's saying that if you want to disagree and say that Qira'ah al-Shaykh is not valid, then look at how your Ustad got the narration. So in his time, we just quoted now from so many tabi'in. So he's saying probably your Ustad went and he read the narration to his Shaykh. So he got the narrations like that. So if he got the narrations like that, then how can you? فكيف ولم لا تجوز لنفسك أن تعرض أنت كما عرض هو. Why don't you want to read to your Ustad like how he read to his Ustad? So this is the first statement. And thereafter it was asked, Ibn Abi Uwais, he said that Imam Malik was asked, he read the Muwatta and he said, As-sama'un wa, can we say we heard it from you? Meantime, we read it and you just listen. So he said that, منه سماع ومنه عرض وليس العرض بأدنى عندنا من السماع. Whether you want to call it عرض, whether you want to call it سماع, both are equal. So this is the view that Ibn Hajar rahmallah is mentioning, that Imam Malik rahmallah and them, they regarded it to be on par with sama', on par with listening directly from the Shaykh. But then leave alone being equal, it is actually transmitted from some scholars that they regarded qira'ah al-Shaykh to be better than sama'. حتى بالغ بعضهم فرجحها على السماع من لفظ الشيخ. That some scholars, they exaggerated and they actually preferred that they said it's better a student must go and read to the Shaykh and the Shaykh must listen. And do you know which scholar is this here? This here Mullah al-Qari rahmallah explained, وَهُوَ مَذْهَبُ الْإِمَامِ أَبِي حَنِيفَةَ رَحِمَهُ اللَّهِ. This is the view of Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah. Again, that is why when we're doing the Muwatta, and that is why in all the Darul Ulums, basically, the student reads and the teacher listens, because this is what Imam Abu Hanifa rahmallah preferred. Alama Rama Urmuzi rahmallah, he quoted from Bishr, وَهُوَ قَوْلُ أَبِي حَنِيفَةَ وَزُفَرَ. That it's the view of Imam Abu Hanifa and the students of Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah. Likewise, Alama Rama Urmuzi narrated with his chain to Abu Asim al-Nabil, سَمِعْتُ سُفْيَانَ وَأَبَا حَنِيفَةَ. Now look here what he's saying. وَمَالِكًا. So Ibn Hajar just quoted from Imam Malik that both are equal. But he's saying that wa Malikan wa Ibn Jurayj. So all of these scholars, they regarded it as... So nevertheless, in spite of Imam Abu Hanifa rahmallah also coming from Iraq. So Ibn Hajar rahmallah said, وَأَبْعَدَ مَنْ أَبَا ذَلِكَ مِنْ أَهْلِ الْعِرَاقِ. So Imam Abu Hanifa rahmallah was also from Iraq. Yet he held a completely different view, and 100% different view compared to that minority that Ibn Hajar rahmallah hinted at. So this is the second view. The first was that view of Imam Malik rahmallah, that both are equal. It doesn't make a difference whether you read to the Shaykh or whether the Shaykh narrates and says it to you. The second view is that it's better for the student to read to the Shaykh. Allama Munawi rahmallah says, الثاني أنها فوق السماع وإليه ذهب أبو حنيفة والليث. Likewise, Imam Layth rahmallah wa Ibn Abi Dhi'bin, they all these scholars, such great scholars, they held this view that it's better when you want to attain hadith that you must read it to the Shaykh. That's the best way to obtain a narration. That is the best way to get ijazah in hadith. In fact, like we explained, that this view is also transmitted from Imam Malik rahmallah, wa ruwiya an Malikin taqwiyatuhu. It is transmitted that Imam Malik rahmallah also regarded this to be a strong view. Alama Munawi rahmallah explains the reasons. فَإِنَّ الشَّيْخَ رُبَمَا سَهَى أَوْ غَلَطَ فِي مَا يُقَرِّرُهُ. That maybe the Shaykh, maybe when he's talking, it's whole day when you're just talking, then you can get a tongue twist. Maybe at times because you're talking so much, so it could be that you can make an error, you can make a mistake, you can pronounce a word. It happens for every person, that sometimes they will mention something incorrectly. So he's saying that maybe the Shaykh can make a mistake, but the student, he doesn't know anything. Why? Lijahli, he's a student, that's why he came to learn, because he's ignorant. So before the Shaykh can transmit to him, he is still ignorant. So he won't be able to correct it. But maybe say that he's a bit of an advanced student, so maybe he knows this narration. Then too, only haybati Shaykh, or maybe because of the awe of his teacher, he will not be able to correct. Imagine sitting in the class and telling the teacher that, sorry, you're making a mistake. You said it incorrectly. And there were those, when you go through Asma al-Rijal, like you will learn Imam Malik rahmallah, how much haybat he had, how much awe he had, how much fear the students had, and respect, like, a fear in a good way, and respect and esteem they had for him. So they wouldn't have the audacity of telling him, they wouldn't have the guts to mention to him that what you said is incorrect. So whether it is an advanced student or a beginner, both won't be able to correct the Shaykh. But وَإِذَا قَرَأَ الطَّالِبُ فَسَاهَا أَوْ أَخْطَأَ رَدَّ عَلَيْهِ الشَّيْخ أَوْ غَيْرُهُ. If the student is reading and the student is making a mistake, then the teacher knows the narration, so the teacher will correct him. Or even if the student is there, the teacher won't have haybat of the student. He won't be fearful of the student. He'll tell the student that stop, what you're reading is wrong. Read it like this. Read it in the correct way. So Ibn Hajar rahmallah mentioned this view in passing, but then he clarifies that the former view, that initial view mentioned from Imam Malik rahmallah, that reading to a Shaykh is equal to listening to a Shaykh, he mentions that that is actually the view that majority of the scholars thereafter took. وَذَهَبَ جَمْعٌ جَمٌّ. So this word جَمٌّ, it's بِفَتْحِ الْجِيم, it's نَعْتُ جَمْعٍ, it's a sifa of the word جَمْعٍ, and معناه كثير, it means a lot, so a very huge group. You can also you get the word جُمٌّ, that means kathara. So in this case, because you're reading it as a sifa, that's why you're reading with a fatha on the jim. So وَذَهَبَ جَمْعٌ جَمٌّ, an extremely huge group of scholars, and not just any type of scholars, minhum al-Bukhari, the likes of Imam Bukhari rahmallah. And Imam Bukhari rahmallah, Ibn Hajar is saying وَحَكَاهُ فِي أَوَائِلِ صَحِيحِهِ. He's saying that firstly he accepted it and mentioned it, and also then he attributed to a more senior earlier scholars. So if you go to Sahih al-Bukhari, right in the beginning, باب ما جاء في العلم وقوله تعالى وقل رب زدني علما. Thereafter he mentions al-qira'a wal-'arad 'ala al-muhaddith. And then he mentions firstly that how Imam Hassan Basri and Imam Saudi and Imam Malik regarded it as a permissible and a valid way of obtaining a narration. And then he mentions a proof for it which could be derived from hadith, where the Imam ibn Ta'alaba told Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, Allahu amaraka an nusalli as-salawah. Did Allah command you that we have to perform salah? And Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, Na'am. So Imam Bukhari rahimahullah said, فَهَذِي قَرَاءَةٌ عَلَى Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. That this year, who's the one uttering the words? It's the Imam uttering the words. Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam didn't say, أَمَرَنَ اللَّهُ أَن نُصَلِّيَ الصَّلَوَاةِ. He didn't say that. But you can say that the statement is a hadith, although the Imam is the one who is mentioning it. So therefore, he makes istidlal from there. And after that he says, وَسَمِعْتُ أَبَا عَاصِمْ يَقُولَ عَنْ مَالِكٍ وَسُفْيَانٍ الْقِرَاءَ لَلْعَالِمْ وَقِرَاءَتُهُ سَوَاهٍ. So he mentions that Sufyan Thawri also mentioned that it doesn't make a difference. Both are equal and both are on par with each other. إلى أن السماع من لفظ الشيخ والقراءة عليه يعني في الصحة والقوة سواء. So in terms of authenticity and in terms of strength, both are equal. Wallahu a'lam. So until here, whatever is mentioned, Mullah al-Qari rahmallah presents the summary of all these points, and he says, وَالْحَاصِلُ أَنَّ الْقِرَاءَةَ مِنَ الطَّالِبِ عَلَى الشَّيْخِ وهو ساكت يسمع. The Shaykh is ساكت يسمع, is sitting quietly listening. ويسميها أكثر المحدثين من أهل المشرق وخراسان عرضا. That most scholars will call us from the east, they'll call us عرض. لكون القارئ يعرض على المحدث مرويه, because the student is presenting his narrations to the Shaykh. سواء قرأ هو, so irrespective whether that narrator himself is the one reading, أو قرأ غيره وهو يسمع, maybe someone else is reading, he is listening. وسواء قرأ من كتاب أو حفظ, maybe he could be reading from a book or maybe he could be reading from memory. وسواء حفظ الشيخ أم لا إذا أمسك أصله هو أو ثقة من السامعين. That in all of these scenarios, أحد وجوه التحمل, these are valid ways of obtaining a narration. وروايته صحيحة عند الجمهور بل عند الكل. So you can see, we mentioned that it's such a small group. So you can see here too is also saying that بل عند الكل. On the next page, Mullah al-Qari rahmallah explains why these scholars regarded both to be equal. So we explained earlier from Allama Munawi rahmallah why Qira'ah al-Shaykh should be preferred, because probably the Shaykh can make a mistake and a student either wouldn't know or he wouldn't have the ability of correcting the Shaykh. Now, why are these scholars not giving preference to one over the other? So he says, هذا ووجه التسوية أن لكل منهما جهة أرجحية ومرجوحية. Each one of them have the pros and cons, the significant points and points which will cause them to lose status. فتعادلا. So because of that, they both are regarded as equal. So you say, look at it. أما العرض, but when you are presenting to a sheikh, then فلتمكن المحدث بإنصاته وإقباله من الرد وعدم تمكن الطالب منه إما لهيبته أو ظنه خطأ ما عنده أو صحته ما معا. So maybe because of these reasons, he's saying now you will give preference to Sama'. But he's saying when the Shaykh is saying it, then also that is وأما اللفظ فلعدم تقليد غيره ومزيد قباله الذي لا يتهيأ له تشاغل عنه إلا بقطع ما هو فيه. But nevertheless, he said ثم الآن العمل على الأول, that now the practice is on the first, where you regard it as both to be the same. وعليه المعول فإنه بالتحقيق أكمل. So again, until here from amongst those who regarded Qira'ah al-Shaykh to be valid, we have mentioned two views. The one is the view of Imam Malik, وإليه ذهب مالك وأصحابه وشياخه وغالب علماء الحجاز. All ulama of Hijaz took this view, والبخاري ورجحه الزركشي في الطائفة وحكاه الصيرفي عن الإمام الشافعي. So that's the one view, that both are equal. And then the second view is from Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah, that Qira'ah al-Shaykh is preferred. وإليه ذهب أبو حنيفة والليث وابن أبي ذئب وطائفة إلى أن فوق السماع وروي عن مالك تقويته. الإمام النووي رحمه الله then mentions the third view. الثالث أنها دونه. The third view is that reading to a sheikh is inferior to السماع. So he says وعليه بعض المشارقة. He's saying that this here is the view of Mashariqa. So Imam Abu Hanifa and regarding reading to the Shaykh to be better, Imam Malik and regarding it to be equal, and now he's mentioning this third view, and he's saying that now you get scholars like Ibn Salah rahimahullah, Imam Nawawi rahimahullah, Al-Masakhawi rahimahullah, etc. They are all preferring this, and they're saying yes, that Qira'ah al-Shaykh is inferior. From the sequence that Ibn Hajar rahimahullah brought these chapters, the fact that he first brought فَاللَّفْذَانِ الْأَوَّلَانِ مِنْ صِيَغِ الْأَدَاءِ, and mentioning there that they are the greatest and they are the highest level, that shows that Ibn Hajar rahimahullah also prefers this view, that the best is for the Shaykh to read and for the student to listen. And then in the next category you get those, and therefore Ibn Hajar rahimahullah also put it in the second category when discussing the words. But then again, you know, the thing which we always mention, that always remember that you do get outside factors which could always strengthen one scenario over the other. Like Ibn Hajar rahmallah mentioned it earlier in this book. We also quoted it from Allama Sakhawi rahmallah in the last lesson. This time we quoted from Allama Laqani. وَقَدْ يَعْرِضُ مَا يَصِيرُ الْعَرْضُ أَوْلَى. That sometimes you will get a point which will then make reading to a sheikh being better. كي يكون الضابط أعلم أو أضبط. Maybe the sheikh now is advanced in his age. Maybe now he's starting to lose memory. So maybe so it's better for the student to rather read it to the sheikh. Or maybe the sheikh is starting to lose his eyesight. So now you can only look in his book. Then again, it's better for the student to look. So like that, you will have to look at these kind of external factors. Going back to the broader map, Ibn Hajar rahmallah thus far discussed the first two categories and the different words which comes in these two categories. The first category was two words, سمعت and حدثني, and then the second category was أخبرني and قرأت عليه. It also goes into the third category, قرئ عليه وأنا أسمع, but he mentioned that how these two words could all form part of one category. So now moving on, he discusses the next word. You remember in his table on the previous page, he said, ثُمَّ أَنْبَأَنِي وَهِيَ الرَّابِعَةُ. So now he is discussing the words of imba. So these are now words of ijaza. Allama Munawi rahmallah said, وَلَمَّا أَنْهَى الْمُصَنِّفُ الْكَلَامَ عَلَى صِيَغِ الْأَدَاءِ وَالسَّمَاعِ وَالْقِرَاءَ لَلشَّيْخِ شَرَعَ يُبَيِّنُ صِيَغَ الْإِجَازَة. Now he's explaining words of ijaza. So here now it's not, the Shaykh is not mentioning anything, he's not reading any of the ahadith, neither is the student reading any of the ahadith. Rather, in just a few moments, the student is asking, did you give me ijaza? And the Shaykh is saying, yes, I give you ijaza. And then now the student got ijaza to transmit all those narrations from the Shaykh. So he says, وَالْإِنْبَاءُ مِنْ حَيْثُ اللُّغَةُ وَاصْطِلَاحُ الْمُتَقَدِّمِينَ بِمَعْنَى الْإِخْبَارِ. Like we said that it was in last year's exams why you're saying لُغَةُ after the word مِنْ حَيْثُ. So by now you must have researched it and you know very well. So he's saying that lughatan, if you have to look at it, imba, whether you say amba'ani fulanun or whether you say akhbarani fulanun, both have the same meaning. If someone say tell us to another person, so you go to the other person and you say amba'ani fulanun, or whether you say akhbarani fulanun, same difference. So min haythul lugha, kama like in the Quran it comes wala yunabbi'uka mithlu khabir. So you can see in Surah Fatir verse 14, isn't? So wala yunabbi'uka mithlu khabir. And thereafter you also then get akhbar coming in the meaning. يَوْمَئِذٍ تُحَدِّثُ أَخْبَارًا. So all has the same meaning. So based on this, the same laws of ikhbar apply. وَحِينَئِذٍ فَيُفْرِرُ لِمَنْ قَرَى بِنَفْسِهِ. If the person is reading alone, then he must say أَنْبَأَنِي if he's alone, if he's the only one there. And if there are many others, like how we mentioned for ikhbar, then he should say أَنْبَأَنَا عَلَى مَا هُوَ الْأَحْسَنُ السَّابِقُ. So, but then Ibn Hajar clarifies, إِلَّا فِي عَرْفِ الْمُتَأَخِّرِينَ, that so according to the mutaqaddimin, those who were transmitting a hadith through a sanad, they would regard both to be in the same meaning. But then the mutaakhirin came and they started to make a distinction. They now began to say that no, you can only use the word amba'ani if you got ijaza. So it's similar to the word an. Why? لأنها في عرف المتأخرين للإجازة. Now, very specifically on this mas'ala, in the beginning of the kitab, if you're doing revision, you remember, we quoted that Allama Dhahabi rahmallah mentioned in Mizan al-I'tidal that the difference between mutaqaddimin and mutaakhirin is around the year 300. They say around the year 300 because if the Shaykh was born in 270, for example, and he lived till 330, then you regard him as, you put him into either the side of the camp or that side. So nevertheless, but very specifically for this mas'ala, in his Nukat, Ibn Hajar rahmallah said, أَمَّا الْمُتَأَخِّرُونَ وَهُمْ مِنْ بَعْدِ الْخَمْسْمِئَةِ وَهَلُمَّ جَرَّةً. That year for this mas'ala is referring to mutaakhirun, those who came after the year 500 Hijri. So that means after Allama Khatib rahmallah, after all those scholars in the who lived in the 400s. So only for this mas'ala, when he's talking mutaqaddimin and mutaakhirin refers to those who came after the year 500 Hijri. فَاصْطَلَحُوا عَلَيْهَا لِلْإِجَازَةِ. So they then started to dedicate this word only for ijaza. But as for those who came before the year 500, in the 400s, in the 300s, they would regard it to be in the same meaning of ikhbar. That means when you read to a Shaykh, you can use the word amba'ani. So Ibn Hajar rahmallah clearly mentioned the word ijaza now. So he says, لأنها في عرف he said, فهو للإجازة. Again, he says, لأنها في عرف المتأخرين للإجازة. So you could have simply used a pronoun and referred back to the former ijaza, which came about 9 words earlier. And therefore, Allama Qasim in Kutlu Bughatu came to task for that. Al-Muqam Maqam al-Idmar لتقدم ذكرهم وهو أقصر. That he ought to bring a pronoun. He could just say, لأنها في عرف المتأخرين. He could maybe say لها. But here he said lil ijaza, so he's mentioning the word apparent again, and therefore it goes against the laws of balagha. But Mullah al-Qari rahmallah responds that قلت عدل عن الإضمار إلى الإظهار دفعا لوهم العود إلى المتقدمين. That maybe someone would assume that this word ijaza, if he brings a pronoun, they would assume that the pronoun is going back to mutaqaddimin. And therefore, he's saying that he brought the word clearly. Last lesson we finished 5 minutes earlier, so therefore we have to carry on for 5 minutes now, inshallah. So other points here is that Allama Qasim rahmallah then quotes from Ibn Hajar rahmallah regarding those who came in between. So like they were born, like we say, in 450 Hijri, 460, 470, and they passed away, they left through the 500. So now, in which camp do they fall? Are they regarded as mutaqaddimin or are they regarded as mutaakhirin? So Ibn Hajar rahmallah, Allama Qasim rahmallah quotes Ibn Hajar rahmallah is saying, قال المصنف والطبقة المتوسطة بين المتقدمين والمتأخرين لا يذكرون الإنباء إلا مقيدا للإجازة. That they would make it مقيدا للإجازة. So they would say أنبأنا فلان إجازة. So they would mention the word إجازة clearly and emphatically. So they would use it for إجازة, but they would mention the word إجازة. And if they use it without the word إجازة, so now you can understand how it developed. And the mutaqaddimin used to just say amba'ana when they read to the Shaykh. Then you got this group of people coming and then they saying amba'ana fulanun ijazatan. So that means they started to use it for ijazah, but they would use the word ijazatan. So they took it away, they started to take it away from qira'a al-Shaykh. And now they are extending it to ijazah. And thereafter, others came and then they dropped off the word ijazah and they would just use it as for ijazah. فلما كثر واشتهر استغنى المتأخرون عن ذكره. When it became common and popular, and then the mutaakhirun, they now no more would say ijaza. Now Ibn Hajar rahmallah jumps to the 8th category. So we talked about this broader map that he first spoke about, the first category, reading to the Shaykh, then the second category, where the first category where the Shaykh mentions it, the second category where the student reads, the third category where there's in ijaza. So you are supposed to talk of munawala now. If you go to the categories to his table, he got to munawalani, but he jumps and goes straight to the 8th category. So maybe there's one of two reasons. Maybe because he said فَهُوَ لِلْإِجَازَةِ كَعَنْ. Maybe because he spoke about the word an. So therefore he thought that instead of going to the 5th category, rather he just discussed the word an since he mentioned it. So that's the one reason. Or maybe he wanted to group all the narrations according to ittisal. So Shaykh Rahili rahmallah, Shaykh Rahili, he says in a footnote, بعد أن أنهى المؤلف صيغ الأداء التي تعد أصلا في الاتصال جاء بالأداء التي ليست أصلا في الاتصال وهي العنعنة. So he brings now what is called the chapter of عنعنة. So he says وعنعنة. So you can see this word عنعنة وعنعنة المعاصر. It's called عنعنة. Allama Munawi rahmallah mentioned that rather Mullah al-Qari rahmallah, he defined this term an'ana. He said اعلم أن الأنعنة مصدر مصنوع كالبسملة والحمدلة. So like how you make up a masdar, like basmala, you know, for Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, they just made up the masdar basmala. So it's not a fi'al, it's just a masdar. You first fabricate a masdar and from there then you can get a fi'al. So originally it wasn't a masdar, they just made it up. So in the same way, an-ana, they just made it up. Min an-anat al-hadith. So he says that you say an-ant al-hadith when you narrate with the word an. So when there's an in the sunnah, then you say you use you call it as, you can either use a verb and say an-ana, this person brought the word an, or you can say this is a mu'an-an sanad, or you can say there is ta'an-unya. So like that you can use it. So to understand what is an-ana, you can understand the simple words that Shaykh Nuruddin Itr wrote here in the footnotes. Al-ana here riwaya bi-an, bi-ay yaqula rawi an fulan. So simple. That in the sanad if you find the word an, then you know it's a mu'an-an, it's an an-ana narration. Wal-hadith al-mu'an-an huwa al-hadith alladhi fi sanadihi an fulan. Now Ibn Hajar rahmallah only mentioned about the word an. But on the previous page, Ibn Hajar rahmallah mentioned other words that are similar when discussing that 8th category. He said, if you go on the previous page in those 8 categories of words, what did he write there? ثم عن ونحوها من الصيغ المحتملة للسماع والإجازة ولعدم السماع أيضا وهذا مثل قال وذكر وروى. You have these kind of words, قال ذكر روى. So Ibn al-Hanbali rahmallah said regarding these words, وَأَمَّا جَمِيعُ مَا كَانَ النَّحْوُ عَنْ فالظاهر أن حكمه حكمها عند قاضي القضاء في جميع ما ذكر. All these words will have the similar ruling. Inshallah, we'll discuss the ruling on Saturday. Until then, جزاكم الله خيرا. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.